Not Common Sense, a podcast created to help you cut through the crap and feel confident in your finances. Get ready to be a money savvy genius because you're about to receive the financial education you've always needed. In this episode, we're chatting with Alyssa Davies about saving for big moments. Hi, Alyssa. I'm so glad to have you on this episode today.
Thanks for having me. I'm pumped to be here.
Alyssa Davies is a content specialist for Zolo and a published author living in Calgary, Alberta. She's the founder of the two-time award-winning Canadian personal finance blog of the year, Mixed Up Money, that has over 40,000 followers across social media. Very impressive. Through the founding of this blog, she has been featured in many notable publications, including the Globe and Mail, Flair, Global News, and more. Her first book, The 100-Day Financial Goal Journal, was released in May 2020. Alyssa has been a freelance writer for 6 years, and her topics of choice include personal finance, home ownership, real estate, and mental health. But as you all know, today we'll be focusing on personal finance. Weddings, a house, children, you name it. It sounds like it should be super easy, but the reality is that these are very big expenses that not everyone can afford. Millennials are part of the first generation to remain unmarried, child-free, and renting with roommates well into their 30s. 40 years ago, that concept would have been so strange to anyone over the age of 18, but it's turning into more and more of a reality many young Canadian adults are facing, including me. Inflation, the rising housing market, and other living costs have increased so much that young Canadian adults have to make a choice to sacrifice their major life goals and dreams. This means putting things like buying a home, having a wedding, and having kids on the back burner. But is it possible to truly have it all as a millennial? Okay, so saving is one thing, but saving a huge amount to spend on a luxurious wedding or to put as a down payment on a home is another. And I feel like I definitely have not prioritized this type of saving in my life. And as I'm getting closer and closer to these big milestones, which is kind of crazy because I still feel like I'm 21, but I'm actually 28. I'm realizing that I really need to get on this like yesterday. But rent prices continue to increase and people are forced to spend more than a third or even half of their income on rent alone. So my question to you, Alyssa, is how are we supposed to afford rent while planning for the wedding or house of our dreams?
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. I feel like I still think I'm 21 sometimes, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, I'm actually a decade older than that. And time has just slipped away from me. But trying to manage financial goals like saving for the future while you're also trying to get a handle on your day-to-day budgeting can feel astronomical. So before you focus on those savings goals, the best place to start is actually by getting to know what comes in and what goes out every single month. Statistics like that, how many people a quarter of your income goes towards rent, those can feel so overwhelming when you hear them. So you're like, well, if that's the majority, then I'll just accept it and deal with what I have. But instead, you can just take like small actionable steps that can actually make a massive difference with your finances. Because once you know how much you're earning and spending every single month, then you can actually put together some tangible steps to start saving and start investing in your future.
That's so smart. And I think it definitely makes it less stressful because speaking of stressful statistics, I actually read that in 1976, the price of an average Canadian home was around $200,000 and the median full-time earnings for a 25 to 34-year-old was $54,000. But in 2017, the average home price was $510,000 and the income for the same group actually went down and was $49,000. So I feel like the gap has definitely narrowed and leaves little room for saving. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about those numbers. I get so many people coming to me talking about like, how am I ever going to be able to afford a home? Like I don't have the income and house prices are crazy, which they are. Those numbers that you just shared, they give us a really good insight into what we call a generational wealth gap. So like older generations with, which would be like our parents, so boomers, they've had access to so much more wealth than us because the cost of living or day-to-day things that you spend your money on, they were on par with what they were earning. Whereas today it's like all of those things that we want to buy thrown in with keeping wages stagnant, it becomes impossible to stay on top of your money. And I was just looking at these numbers this week. So it was funny when you shared that statistic because it was a hot topic on Twitter as well. It came out that millennials only have 4.8% of all wealth, like in the entire world.
That's
And
insane.
yeah, and then even scarier than that, Mark Zuckerberg, like Facebook founder, he has 2% of all that wealth. So like he has half of the wealth that millennials have. So we have not a ton of money, but at the same time, we're the most educated generation. Millennials, we're smart. We have that going for us. So that's one good thing. But seeing those type of numbers, again, it's like makes you feel like you don't ever have those same opportunities that your parents had. And also it's frustrating because a lot of our parents don't see that. So they're like telling you, well, just buy a house. Like it's going to be so great for your future. And you're like, Mom, Dad, like I cannot afford a house. Like it's not the same as it was when you were growing up. And so again, rather than let those statistics kind of drive home this feeling of I'm never going to own a home, there are so many steps that come before that. So like I just have to keep reminding myself, and I like others to remind themselves that it's not just like I'm a one thing, like I'm not going to get a house. There's just so many people that think home ownership is the ultimate goal and ultimate dream, but something to remember and remind yourself of is that a home is still a home, whether you rent or own. It does not matter if you own a home yet. And if you want to achieve that goal, it starts again with taking those really small, actionable steps.
I love that. No, for sure. I'm lucky that I have parents who kind of understand. But it's funny because the other day my aunt was legit telling my mom, "Why doesn't Naomi buy a home? She's so close to 30. Like, why does she keep renting?" As if like,
Yeah, so
I'm
easy.
just sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars and just don't want to.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's so true that I think it takes a while for the older generation to kind of understand that. And hopefully eventually they will. But another thing that I feel like I struggle with is the whole comparison game. So especially with social media, I'll be scrolling through my feed and seeing like Jane Doe over here having this extravagant wedding while I can barely afford chicken nuggets. I'm like searching under my couch. I'm like, is there any change? So yeah, I mean, the average, I think, Canadian wedding costs around $20,000. And the reality is that many couples can actually only afford that if their parents contribute to covering some of the costs. But like, what if we don't want to rely on our parents, or you're like me and you can't? Like, how do we save up for that ourselves?
Yeah. And that's another great point as well. Like a lot of people don't have access to that generational wealth. And I think something that people don't realize is that the majority of people can't just ask their parents for money, or their parents don't just have savings for them lying around. So you're more normal or you're more average if you don't have access to that generational wealth. So first and foremost, like don't feel shame or don't feel like you're falling behind because your parents can't help you pay for your wedding. It's really normal and there's nothing wrong with that. And I remember feeling all those same feelings and asking myself those same questions when I was planning my wedding, and reminding myself again, like, well, I don't want to be average. I don't want to spend $20,000 on my wedding. I want to spend less on my wedding. I want to enter my marriage debt free. I want to pay for it all myself. Like those things are more important to me. And everyone is different. And so for that reason, we had to sit down, like my partner and I, which is step one if you're planning a wedding, is sitting down with your partner and actually having a really good, deep conversation about money and understanding a realistic number. Like, what can we actually afford? And how many, like, we asked ourselves so many questions, like, how many people is realistic for a wedding? Like, how many meals can we afford to buy for the guests? And how do we feel about eloping? Like, let's look at both spectrums of a wedding, like one that's very, very simple and one that's very extravagant. And we had some really great discussions about what was important to us long term, not just the wedding day, which I think a lot of people forget is that that's just one day. You are going to be with this person, or you want to be with this person for the rest of your life. So, how can you have those really good discussions about what's going to benefit you long term and what you really want long term? Like, what are your other financial goals aside from a wedding? And then once we had that really good conversation, it was like, okay, let's make a budget based on what we know we can afford and see what we can have. And does it cover all of the things that we want? So we also gave ourselves like a ton of time to plan, which is one of the benefits of a wedding is you don't have to have it in like the next 2 months. Some people want to do that, but you can wait. So we gave ourselves a year and a half and we started to plan and prepare for the cost. And we also started making payments right away, because that's another benefit of weddings is you can start to put deposits down and you can start making small payments whenever you're ready. And I find that breaking up big financial goals like a wedding or a down payment, it's so much easier and you can keep your motivation a lot longer when you have like small marks of like, okay, I've done this. So now what am I saving for?
Mm-hmm. No, that's so true. And I think also like a great thing about our generation is like we all are kind of in the same boat. So it's not like we're going to weddings expecting this big extravagance. And honestly, some of the best like weddings I've been to have been like, you know, screw the 3-course meal. Like here's an open taco bar, or like we're ordering pizza,
Yes.
right? Like we don't place as much value, I think, in those like super extravagant things, which is can be nice.
Yeah. And like we only had 35 guests at our wedding because that was one way to keep the cost down.
Mm.
And so many people are like, how did you do that? And I'm like, well, like it was a really big discussion of like, should we invite our extended family or should we just keep it really, really intimate? Because that's going to save us a ton of money and like they'll get over it, you know?
Mhm.
But
No, I love that.
it's like having those discussions of like, what can we like, how can we shift this? Because it's your day. It doesn't have to be a traditional thing. It's
Mhm.
everyone's wedding is different.
No, that's amazing. So first comes love, then comes marriage, and then comes a baby and a baby carriage. And I know that raising kids is like a whole other ball game, and childcare costs have increased 40% since 1970, which is just insane to think about. And honestly, it's something that I've never worried about until now. Like I always figured that I just deal with it as I got closer to that stage of life, and then I blinked and bam, I'm close to that stage in life. And in 2015, I read that the yearly cost of raising a child in Canada was $13,366, which adds up to over $240,000 over 18 years. It just blows my mind. And 64% of people actually say that the cost of for childcare is way too expensive. I'm definitely part of that percentage. So it only makes sense that a lot of millennials have actually chosen to go without. But what about those who do want kids? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I have a kid and I have one on the way. So I can tell you that we did track every single dollar that we spent in year 1 because I was curious and I wanted to be able to help my friends that weren't like having kids yet so I could say this is exactly how much I spent. So like this is what you can kind of prepare for mentally and with your money. So like in year 1 we spent $9,000. And that was with a newborn, and that was without those childcare costs. So I don't like to scare people by sharing those numbers, but I also want people to realize it is expensive and give them that space to prepare for those expenses. Because one thing I like to remind people of is that you can start saving for future goals whenever you want. Like
Hmm.
you might not be married, you might not have decided if you want to have kids yet, but you can still start saving for kids. You might not be pregnant, you can still save for kids. It's not weird. It's not like no one can see that you're saving for these things because I think that's something people would be like, well, people are going to think I'm weird if I'm saving for a baby that I don't have yet. That's not true. They'll never know. And if that's something that you're serious about and you have the time, the luxury of time on your side to save for those big goals, then just start saving for them. Just put $20 away every week and put it in a baby fund. And, that's okay. I did that. I just started right after I got married. I was putting like $20 away every single month, which was nothing. But at the same time, I was like, well, it's something, it's starting for a baby fund. And I didn't even know if I wanted kids, but I was like, well, I'll just do it. And by the time I actually ended up pregnant, which was unexpected and unplanned, so I'm really thankful that I started saving that, I had $500 already, which wasn't enough, obviously, but it was like, okay, well, I have a start. So now this is a little bit less overwhelming.
Hmm.
And the other thing is, I say, like, the worst thing that can happen is you decide you don't want kids or you decide it's not for you. And then you have all of this money saved. You can put it towards whatever you want. You can go on a vacation. You can go to Europe. You have money. So, like, that's all that matters is just start saving for things, even if it doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
Oh, I love that so much. Cause yeah, here I am, like 28 years old, a single Pringle. And I actually write letters to my future husband. I haven't even met him yet. So I don't know why saving for a child is just so far off, but that makes so much
See, like,
sense.
if you're
And
already writing those love letters, you can start putting money away for your kids' college fund. It's fine.
yeah, I love that. That's amazing. And I think we should make that normal. Like we should talk about that with our friends, right? And like have those
Yeah,
conversations instead of just making it such a taboo subject.
totally agree.
Nothing wrong with hope. This podcast is sponsored by Coho. So, you and your partner, pal, or parent have been sending back and forth e-transfers for mortgage payments
rent, groceries, takeout, etc.? Why not make your life easier with a Coho joint account? Not only will you be able to share finances and savings goals, you'll also be able to stack up those savings together. With a Coho joint account, you'll both receive a matching prepaid Visa card, which is stunning, by the way, and get at least 0.5% cash back on every purchase. Plus, you'll earn 1.2% interest on the entire joint account if you sign up to direct deposit. To make sure that you two are on the same savings track, you can also get instant notifications when you and your partner spend. So, join the club with a joint account. Download the Coho app and sign up today.
So clearly there are a lot of different savings accounts, RRSPs, TFSAs, GICs. So which one would you say is best for saving large amounts of money and why? Like, how do you choose between them? Should you have all of them?
Yeah. So what you just said right there is good. Like, should you have all of them? Probably. Like, there's a use for each one of those things you just mentioned. They all have a use. When you're saving for long-term goals, there's a couple of things you should always ask yourself when you're deciding, like, where should I be putting this money? If it's a short-term financial goal, which typically I would say like is anything less than 5 years from now, you can save that in a high interest savings account. Then it's safe, it's protected, it's easily accessible if you decide you need to pull that money out sooner. And there are a ton of great options for high interest savings accounts. They don't have a great return. Look for a high interest savings account that works for you. And then if it's a long-term goal, like 5+ years from now, then I would invest that money. Like if you're investing for retirement, you can do that in both a TFSA and an RRSP. There's nothing wrong with having both. A TFSA is sometimes really great to have if you aren't making as much income, like if you're entry level income or if you're just starting out, because that leaves room in your RRSP for when you are earning a higher income. So you'll get a little bit more of a tax break when you have a higher income. And then one thing to do when you're looking at these accounts and deciding what the best move is just to compare banks, compare credit unions, see what makes sense for you. Look at the bank fees, like how much are you going to have to pay to keep money in that bank? And just make sure you're doing your due diligence to decide which one's the best. But typically, if you're saving for multiple goals, you're going to want to have multiple accounts. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with having multiple banks open either. Some people think like, well, I've been with this bank since I was a kid, so I'm just going to keep using this bank. It's okay if someone else has a better interest rate or seems like they have a better fit for what you're looking for at this point in your life to go somewhere else and find something else.
Okay, that's awesome. Yeah, because right now I kind of just have one big savings account. But I like the idea of opening separate ones for separate goals. I think that makes sense, right?
Yeah. And then they're also out of sight, out of mind. So if you have one that's in a separate bank account for a savings goal, or you're not seeing it every day, you're not tempted to take that money out for other things. And it's just easy to set up like an automatic transfer and just not worry about it.
Very smart. Very smart. So how much would you say, I guess, roughly should be saved for a down payment on a house? Like what percentage? And then like maintaining mortgage payments. I feel like there's just so much to take into consideration. I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, down payments are an interesting one. A lot of people will often hear like you need that 20% down. The reason they'll tell you that is because if you don't put 20% down on a home in Canada, you'll actually have to pay Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation fees, which is like their mortgage insurance. So that means that kind of like if you cannot pay your mortgage anymore or something happens and you're struggling financially, that you have this insurance to protect you. And so oftentimes they're like, yeah, put 20% down, then you don't have to worry about that because it's an additional cost on your mortgage. But what a lot of people don't realize, and this is good news, I think, is that if you put 20% down or more on a home, you're actually more of a risk to a lender, to a bank, because you don't have that additional insurance. So if something does happen to you financially and you can't repay your mortgage, then you're more of a risk to the bank because they'll have to cover that loss. So essentially, if you put less than 20% down, you are actually more likely to get a significant reduction in your mortgage rate premium. So like you might be able to score a better mortgage rate, which is awesome because that keeps your mortgage lower. And banks might be more likely to lend to you as well. So the sweet spot is actually 10%. So if you can put to 20% down on a house, that's amazing. Like that is perfect. And if you want to put 20% down or more, that's amazing as well. But just realize that you don't have to put 20% down. If you can get to that 10%, that is amazing.
Wow, that makes it so much more doable and like feels like it can actually be a reality now. That's good to know.
For sure.
Is there a specific amount of money that you would say one should have in their savings before having a kid or a wedding? Because, you know, once those things happen, I don't want to be completely broke after.
Yeah, I get those questions a lot too. It's like, how do you know when you're financially ready to have a kid? And how do you know when you're ready to buy a home? And I don't know if you'll ever have this magical feeling of like, okay, this is the perfect amount of money. I am ready to have a kid now. I don't know if you can ever prepare for the cost of becoming a parent. It's a really overwhelming amount of money, and it's not just for 1 year, and it's not just a one-time expense. It's a recurring expense, and it's something that you're constantly thinking about because you want to provide the best for your children, obviously. So, will you ever be financially ready for a kid? I don't know if there's an answer there, but you can start saving as much as you want and as much as you can as early as possible to make that feeling a lot less overwhelming. So I'm not going to go ahead and say like, yeah, if you have $10,000, you're ready. But if you are seriously considering having a kid in the next few months, you can start doing the math to see how much money you would need for that first year, second year of parenting by just saying like, well, if I want to take 12 months of maternity leave or 12 months of parental leave in Canada, then this is how much money I'll get from the government. And you can kind of work that backwards into your current budget to see how much money you'll actually need, if that makes sense. So there are some ways you can kind of make estimates, but having this one straight up number to give you for a down payment or for a baby is impossible because we all have such unique financial situations.
Yeah, of course. And what kinds of big costs do you need to consider when planning for children?
Yeah, there are a lot. So if you aren't able to take the full year of parental leave, like maybe you're an entrepreneur, you should start saving for those childcare costs that would come up a little bit sooner than they would for others. It's never too early to save for childcare if you know that's something you're going to need. Other big items obviously are just like having that gear that every parent needs, like a stroller and a crib and all of those things. They add up really quickly. They're quite expensive, but also to remember that you don't have to buy the most expensive products if you're planning to have a kid. I was just doing this because we're like getting ready for baby number 2. I'm like, I want a fancier stroller this time. Like, I need this stroller. It's beautiful. Everyone has this one. And then I'm looking at it and I'm like, wait, where's the cup holder for my coffee? Like, that is an essential for me. I need a place to put my coffee. And it was like, oh, you have to pay an extra $50 for this coffee cup holder. And I'm like, is this a joke? Like, I'm already going to pay $800 for a stroller and then I have to pay like an extra $50 for a coffee holder? I don't think so. So I just reminded myself, I'm like, every single baby item passes the same safety standard test. So it does not matter what brand you buy, how fancy it is, they all pass the same test. So don't get caught up in brands or like trying to appeal to like the other moms in your community or the other dads in your community. Just focus on what you can afford.
Yes, so key. That's so funny. Like the $50 extra coffee cup. It's kind of like when you buy electronics and Apple's like, you need to pay this much more for the charger. And it's just like, this is a necessity. Why?
I know, like this should come with it.
At what age should you start an RESP for your child? These acronyms gets me all tongue-tied all the time.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, that's a registered education savings plan. So that would be where you'd save your college fund for your kids, for their future. Very important if you want to be able to kind of pass down that generational wealth we talked about earlier. You cannot open an RESP until your baby is born. So as soon as they're born and as soon as you have their SIN number, then you're free to open an RESP, which takes not a lot of work depending where you open one. So you can just Google like robo-advisor, RESP, open it, and like, I don't want to worry about this. And just set that account up whenever you have a free minute. And as far as contributing money, whenever you're financially able. It can be really overwhelming stepping into parenthood and having all of these extra expenses and then being like, oh, I have to start saving for college today because they're 0 years old and I have, in 10 years from now or in 20 years from now, they're going to need $15,000 a year for their tuition. Like, you're not going to be thinking about that when you just had a baby. So If you can't afford to put any money aside for an RESP right away, don't worry about it. What I say is the most important thing is making sure that your future and your retirement is covered, because the last thing you want is to have all this money for their college education and then 30 years from down the line, it doesn't matter because they're going to be supporting you in retirement. So make sure that you put on your oxygen mask first and set yourself up for financial success before you worry about it. If you are able to contribute to an RESP, you can also look into what government grants are available, because the government does provide some financial support for parents, which is amazing. And that money just goes directly into your RESP, which is awesome. So they sometimes double it. And so you can just look at all of those numbers, but as much as you can, and don't stress about it too much. Like at the beginning, I was only putting $25 a month into my kids' RESP because that's all I could afford on maternity leave. And that was my reality. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm. And I think thankfully in Canada, there are many opportunities. Like, for example, my parents are immigrants and they were only able to save about 1 year's tuition because they have 3 kids. And again, I was so grateful for that, but I was able to work and apply for scholarships and pay off the rest of my tuition on my own. So I think that hopefully can take some pressure off of like new parents, right?
Yeah, I feel like we all feel this obligation and this shame if we can't provide for our children's future college education, but you are doing your best if you're able to support them up until they're 18. Like if you're able to put food on the table, if you're able to make sure that they're doing all the things that they love and they're happy, then that should be your primary focus. I know that it's important to people to save for those things, but I just want to remind everyone that you shouldn't feel ashamed if you cannot come up with that money, because it's expensive.
Mm-hmm. Man, after this conversation, I just want to send my parents some flowers and a thank you card. I didn't realize how much they spent on me.
I know, it's crazy.
So what can a millennial do to make getting married, having kids, and owning a house more financially viable?
So what you can do is, like I said, if you're in that situation where, like how you said, you're 28 and you're like, okay, where do I start? This is a lot of things I want to prioritize here. It's difficult to decide which one comes first. Something that a lot of people don't recognize or realize is that money is extremely emotional. So how we spend it is emotional, how we save is emotional, and all of those things you can kind of take into account when you're deciding which goals you should prioritize and which goals are most important to you. So if you're saving for a wedding and that's coming up really quick, then that might be where your focus is, and that's okay. And so you can just focus on that altogether, or you can split the goals up and evenly distribute your money to each of them. But like I said, I think the best thing to do is sit down with yourself and ask yourself, like, what is the most important to me and which one tugs at my heartstrings the most? Like, if I really, really want a kid right now, then it's okay to focus everything you have on that one goal. It doesn't have to be a one size fits all solution with money. Everyone's different. So like figuring out what you want and what works for you is step number 1.
Yeah, I think that's so key. And I think as we grow and like as life happens, like our priorities change. Cause I know before my priority for saving was traveling. And yeah, that was like kind of my early 20s and mid 20s. I just wanted to spend all my money on travel, but now that's changed and I need to save for something, more stable. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How much would you actually say that someone should have in an emergency fund if you're already saving for all of these expenses? Like, for example, I've been lucky to live at home for a majority of my life and started working at 17. So I've always had a small savings account. And that would be about like $5,000. Like, would you say that's a pretty reasonable amount for an emergency fund, or how do you even figure out that number?
Yeah, I think it's weird because prior to the pandemic, every single expert on planet Earth was like 3 to 6 months of expenses is great. That'll help you if you lose your job. That'll help you if your car breaks down. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think what we realized is like 3 to 6 months wasn't really enough for a lot of us during the pandemic. If you lost your job, you might not have gotten it back within 6 months. You might still not have it. And so knowing that perfect number, or like saying $5,000 is good, again, hard to say for each individual person. It's like, what is your essential bare bones budget every single month that if you could not work at all, that you would need to get by? And so from there, it's like, what are you comfortable with? If you think that 3 months is enough and you feel good about that number, then that's great. If you feel like 6 months is enough, great. You might feel like you need more than that. One thing that I do is like, because I'm a homeowner, I like to look at what could possibly go wrong with my home. So I'm like, what happens if our biggest appliance breaks down? How much is that going to cost me? And then from there, I could say, okay, well, it's going to cost this much. So that's how much I'm going to save in our household emergency fund. And vice versa kind of thing for like any other emergency, like losing my job. Like I need to cover this much ground for this much time.
Okay, that makes sense. And so do you have different emergency accounts for different emergencies, or do you kind of keep it all in one?
Yeah, what you're going to find with me is I'm a little overkill on accounts because I feel like it's so much easier to compartmentalize all of my goals. So like I do have a family emergency fund, which is like general for emergencies, for job loss, for all that kind of stuff. Then we have our household emergency fund, which again is like what happens if our appliance breaks down, because that happens all the time. It happened to us like 2 weeks after we moved in. And then the last one I have is like a personal emergency fund to protect myself as a female. And I know that sounds a little weird, but I have been in jobs where I have been really uncomfortable, put in uncomfortable situations and felt trapped. And I also have had a lot of friends who have been in really stable relationships suddenly lose that and have nothing. And so I think emergency funds are important for that reason as well, to protect yourself from anything that can go wrong. And I always tell my girlfriends that, like, make sure you have something to protect yourself if something in your relationship doesn't work out, because you never want to be left feeling like you're starting from scratch, which is what a lot of people end up having if they exit a relationship unexpectedly. So I have 3 emergency funds. Is that overkill? Probably. But I feel so protected and so comfortable that if anything was to go wrong today or tomorrow, that I would be okay.
Wow. And I especially love that last account. Like that's just so empowering and something that I think most of us don't even think about. So I love that piece of advice.
Yeah, it's kind of like a little bit of worst case scenario thinking, which comes in part with me being a pessimist, but also it's like a reality that happens to so many of us. And we never want to think it's going to happen to us. And I don't think it's going to happen to me, but I'm covered if it does.
Yeah, man, if only I had the statistics for that, I think everyone would immediately open an account for that right now.
Yeah. And like my husband knows I have it. So it's something that we openly talk about. And I think he has one as well. Like it's just about protecting yourself because you never know.
Yeah. And that just shows a healthy relationship too, for sure.
Totally.
So how should millennials prioritize their savings for big moments? Because I know for me, sometimes those big moments just seem so far off. We're just like, I'll deal with it when the time comes. So yeah, what recommendations would you have to prioritize that now and how?
Yeah. So one of the biggest and most important things you should be prioritizing as a millennial is investing for your future. So making sure that you're set up for your retirement. I don't think that we heard that enough growing up, that our retirement account was so important and that putting small amounts of money away when we turned 18 could turn into something so big and powerful. And so a lot of us have to make up for lost time. And I didn't start investing until I turned 25. So no shame if you start later. It happens to a lot of us. We don't really realize how important it is. And now I have to make up for that lost time. But at the same time, I still have 40 years to save for my future. And just by putting a small amount of money away every single month, I don't have to think about it anymore. And so just make sure that you're always contributing to your retirement, whether you have like a pension or you have something through work, just make sure that it's enough. Just do the math and calculate to make sure that your future is prioritized first and foremost. And then from there, we've talked about the emergency fund. That should always be a priority. And also deciding, like we talked about, what goal comes first? How much time do I have to save for each of these goals? What can I afford to put away each month? And I think about that emotional aspect again, like which one of these goals is most in line with what I value right now in my life? And am I doing this for me, or am I doing this because that's what society tells me I should do? Because you don't have to do what everyone else is doing. You don't have to buy a house. You don't have to have kids. You don't have to get married. So make sure you think about that as well.
Yeah, that's so good. Self-reflection, I think is totally key. So I learned so much from you. Thank you so much again for your time. But what do you think is the biggest thing millennials should take out of this episode when it comes to saving for big moments in their lives?
I think I want to leave it on that, like learning to avoid tradition in a certain sense, like being okay with the fact that you don't have a house yet, you don't have kids yet, you don't have a partner yet. Those things all feel like the end of the world to a lot of us when we start to hit our late 20s. Like if we don't have those things lined up and in order, you can feel like overwhelmed and like you're falling behind your peers. And something to remember and remind yourself of is that everyone works in different speeds. And a lot of us don't want the same things that we thought we wanted when we were younger. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you are investing and saving for your future, that's amazing. Like, just make sure that you are focusing on you and what you need, and so that you can actually enjoy your life and feel some kind of freedom when you hit retirement.
Wow, that's so good. I need it like that on a motivational poster so I can plaster it all around my house. Cause yeah, that's awesome. Cause I've definitely felt the pressure. But you're right. We're all on different journeys and different timelines, and there's no need to compare.
Yeah, and you're never behind. Like, you are never behind. Definitely not as behind as you think.
Yes, so true. Yeah. Well, so affording a house, getting married, and having kids has been a dream for so many of us that sadly might not come true now thanks to the inflated cost of living. There are so many things to consider and so many different acronyms for savings accounts that thankfully you've explained to me that have different functions that need to be memorized. But we're here to help you avoid taking a class with a financial advisor. Financial wellness should be available to everyone, and that's exactly what we're talking about in our next episode. No one should be scared to open their mail when they see a bill. That's why Coho has a referral program where you can earn extra cash back and amazing rewards. So help out a friend and get them signed up for Coho. Thanks again for your time.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.